The August sun pressed down on the yard like an iron skillet left too long on coals. Dust hung in the air, thick and slow, stirred only by the shuffle of boots and the occasional cough from the gathered crowd. Flies buzzed around the wooden platform erected in the center of the yard, circling the figures standing there like they could already smell death. Rachel Harmon stood at the edge of the crowd, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other clutching a worn leather purse that held exactly $1.37. Her belly swelled beneath her faded calico dress, 6 months along now, and the weight of it made her knees ache. She shouldn't have come, should have stayed at the cabin, kept her head down, waited for the baby to arrive, and figured out how to survive after that. But she'd heard the rumors in town, heard that Sheriff Dalton was auctioning off men again, wounded soldiers, drifters, anyone who couldn't pay their debts or defend themselves, said it was legal, said it was justice, said a lot of things that made Rachel's stomach turn. She pushed forward through the crowd, ignoring the looks from the ranchers and their wives, the whispers that followed her everywhere now. Poor thing, husband dead 4 months and already showing. What's she gonna do? When she reached the front, she saw him. He lay on his side on the platform, wrists bound behind his back with rope so tight it had rubbed the skin raw. His ankles were tied too, pulled back toward his hands in a way that forced his body into a twisted arch. His shirt was torn open, revealing bruises that mottled his ribs in shades of purple and yellow. Blood had dried in a dark line from his temple down to his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were open, staring at nothing, glazed with pain and something deeper, shame so profound it radiated off him like heat. When a woman in the crowd leaned forward to get a better look, his gaze flickered toward her and his cracked lips moved. "Don't look there." The words were barely audible, a whisper threaded with desperation, not a cry for help, a plea for mercy, for dignity, for the crowd to turn away and let him disappear into the dust. No one did. Sheriff Dalton stood beside him, thumbs hooked into his belt, a grin splitting his weathered face. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a badge pinned to his vest that caught the sunlight and gleamed like it was something holy. Rachel knew better. Dalton had been the one who told her that her husband's death wasn't worth investigating. Just another Union soldier who didn't make it home. Just another name on a list too long to matter. "All right, folks," Dalton called out, his voice booming across the yard. "Next one up. No name, refused to give it. Found him 3 days ago on the edge of the Cartwright property, half dead and carrying nothing but this." He held up a battered canteen, dented and scorched black on one side. "No money, no horse, no papers. Under territorial law, that makes him a vagrant. And vagrants got 2 choices, jail or indenture. He chose indenture." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rachel's fingers tightened around her purse. "Now he's in rough shape, I'll grant you that," Dalton continued, nudging the man's shoulder with the toe of his boot. The man flinched but didn't make a sound. "But he's young, strong enough once he heals up. Good for field work, stable work, whatever you need. Starting bid is $5. "Silence." Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. $5. She didn't have $5, didn't have anything close. "Come on now," Dalton said, his grin fading into a scowl. "Don't tell me you're all gonna let a strong back go to waste just 'cause he's got a few bruises. $4 then." "Still nothing." The man on the platform closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Rachel could see the tremor in his shoulders, the way his bound hands curled into fists. "3, Dalton snapped. $3 and he's yours. Work him till he drops if you want. Ain't no one gonna ask questions." A rancher near the back shifted his weight, considering. Another man whispered something to his companion, but no hands went up. Dalton's jaw tightened. He crouched down beside the man, grabbed a fistful of his hair, and yanked his head up so the crowd could see his face. The man's eyes snapped open, wide and wild, and for a moment Rachel saw something flicker there, not just pain, but recognition. Like he was staring at someone in the crowd, someone he knew. Then his gaze landed on her. And held. Rachel's breath caught. She didn't know this man, didn't recognize his face, battered as it was, but the way he looked at her, like he was drowning and she was the only piece of driftwood in sight, made something inside her chest crack open. $2, Dalton said, his voice low and dangerous now. Final offer, $2 or I throw him in a cell and let him rot. Rachel's hand moved or her mind caught up. She reached into her purse, pulled out the crumpled bills and loose coins, and counted them again, even though she already knew the total. $1.37. Not enough. $2, Dalton barked. Anyone or do I? $1, Rachel said. Her voice cut through the yard like a knife. Every head turned toward her. Dalton straightened, his eyes narrowing. What was that, Mrs. Harmon? She stepped forward, legs shaking, and held up the money. $1, it's all I have. Dalton stared at her for a long moment, then let out a harsh laugh. $1 for a full-grown man. He looked around at the crowd, as if inviting them to share the joke. A few people chuckled, most just watched, silent and uncomfortable. Ma'am, Dalton said, his tone dripping with condescension, I appreciate the charity, but this ain't a church raffle. $1 don't even cover the cost of the rope. It's all I have, Rachel repeated, her voice firmer now, and it's more than anyone else is offering. The man on the platform turned his head toward her again. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but she saw the shape of them. Don't. She ignored him. Dalton scratched his jaw, considering, then he shrugged. Hell, why not? Ain't no one else stepping up, and I got 3 more to get through before sundown. He gestured toward the platform. $1, Mrs. Harmon, he's yours. Do whatever you want with him, just keep him out of my jail. Rachel's knees nearly buckled with relief. She climbed onto the platform, her hands trembling as she counted out the dollar in coins and bills and handed it to Dalton. He pocketed it without a word, then pulled a knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding the man's wrists and ankles. The man gasped, his body sagging forward as the tension released. Rachel knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder to steady him. Can you stand? She asked quietly. He didn't answer, just stared at her with those haunted eyes, like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't add up. Come on, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Let's get you out of here. With effort, he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, then slowly, agonizingly, to his feet. He swayed, and Rachel wrapped an arm around his waist to keep him upright. He was taller than she'd expected, and heavier, all lean muscle and bone beneath the torn shirt. The crowd parted as they made their way down from the platform and across the yard. No one said a word, no one met her eyes. Rachel led him toward the old wagon she'd borrowed from a neighbor, its bed lined with hay and a single blanket. She helped him climb in, and he collapsed onto his side, curling in on himself like a wounded animal. She climbed up onto the driver's seat, took the reins, and urged the horse forward. As they rolled out of the yard and onto the dirt road leading back toward her cabin, Rachel glanced over her shoulder at the man lying in the wagon bed. He was still staring at her. And for the first time since her husband had died, Rachel felt something other than grief settle into her chest. Fear. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, a stone hearth, and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. It sat at the edge of a valley, tucked between 2 low hills where the wind came down cold even in summer. Rachel's husband had built it with his own hands before he'd left for the war, promising he'd come back and add a second story, a proper porch, maybe even a barn. He never came back. Rachel pulled the wagon to a stop outside the door and climbed down carefully, one hand on her belly. The man in the wagon hadn't moved, but his eyes were open, tracking her every movement. Can you walk? She asked. He nodded once and pushed himself up with visible effort. She offered her arm, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. Together, they stumbled inside. The cabin was dim and cool, the windows covered with thin curtains that filtered the sunlight into soft gold. Rachel guided him to the narrow bed in the corner, the same bed where she'd slept beside her husband, where she'd lain awake night after night waiting for him to come home. Sit, she said. He obeyed, lowering himself onto the edge of the mattress with a grimace. Up close, in the light, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The bruises on his ribs were deep, bone-deep maybe. The gash on his temple had been stitched crudely, the stitches uneven and inflamed. His hands were raw from the ropes, and when he shifted, she saw the way he favored his left side, like something inside was broken. Rachel fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth, then knelt in front of him. She dipped the cloth and wrung it out, then reached up to clean the dried blood from his face. He flinched. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly. "You already did," he whispered. She paused, the cloth hovering inches from his skin. "What? You shouldn't have bought me. Would you rather I left you there?" He didn't answer, just closed his eyes and let her work, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow. For a long time, the only sounds were the soft splash of water and the distant cry of a hawk outside. Rachel cleaned the wound on his temple, checked the stitches, then moved to his hands, dabbing away the crusted blood where the ropes had cut into his wrists. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silence." "You don't have to tell me," she said, "but it'd be easier if I had something to call you." Another pause, then so quietly she almost missed it. "Ethan." Rachel's hands stilled. The cloth slipped from her fingers and landed in the basin with a soft splash. "Ethan," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd pulled him off that platform. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said. Rachel's heart was pounding now, a sick, heavy rhythm that made her head swim. "No, should I?" Ethan's gaze dropped to her belly, then back to her face. "Your husband, Daniel Harmon." The name hit her like a fist to the chest. She sat back on her heels, staring at him. "How do you?" "He was my brother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Rachel shook her head slowly, trying to make sense of it. "No, Daniel never mentioned he didn't have." "Half-brother," Ethan said. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting facts he'd memorized long ago. "Same father, different mothers. I grew up on the other side of the county. We didn't see each other much, but we knew." Rachel's mind raced. She thought of Daniel, of the stories he'd told her about his family, his father, a hard man who'd worked the railroads, his mother, who'd died when he was young. He never mentioned a brother, never even hinted. "Why didn't he?" "Because I killed a man," Ethan said simply. The cabin went very still. Rachel's throat tightened. "What?" Ethan looked down at his hands, at the raw, rope-burned skin. "I was 17. There was a man, Harrison Cole. He owned the land next to ours. He wanted our water rights, so he burned our barn, killed our livestock, then came after my mother. I shot him twice, sent a mass." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "Daniel testified for me at the trial, said it was self-defense, said Cole had come onto our property armed and threatening. The jury believed him. I walked free." Rachel felt like the ground was tilting beneath her. "Then why?" "Because after the trial, Cole's family came after us, burned what was left of our farm, ran my mother off the land. And Daniel," Ethan's voice cracked just slightly before he steadied it. "Daniel told me to leave, said as long as I stayed, the Coles would keep coming, so I left, joined the army, fought in the war, and when it ended, I didn't know where else to go, so I came back." "To find Daniel," Rachel whispered. Ethan nodded. "I heard he'd gotten married, heard he had a place out here. I thought," he trailed off, then shook his head. "I got here 3 days ago, asked around in town. That's when I found out he was dead." Rachel's eyes burned. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to break free. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and the rawness in his voice was worse than anything she'd heard all day. "I should have come back sooner, should have." "It wasn't your fault," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "He got sick. Camp fever, they said. It took him in 2 days. There was nothing anyone could have done." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw the grief behind the shame. The same grief she'd been carrying for 4 months, heavy and unrelenting. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear I didn't know." Rachel reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't as badly torn. "I believe you." They sat like that for a long moment, two strangers bound by a man who was gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel asked finally. "Back there at the auction, why didn't you say something?" Ethan's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so bitter. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me, and even if you did, I didn't want you to buy me out of pity." "It wasn't pity," Rachel said. "Then what was it?" She thought about that, thought about the moment she'd seen him on that platform, bound and broken, and the way something inside her had screamed that she couldn't just walk away. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it wasn't pity." Ethan looked at her for a long time, searching her face for something. Then he nodded once and leaned back against the wall. "You should have left me there," he said again, quieter this time. "Probably," Rachel agreed, "but I didn't." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and crossed to the small kitchen. There was bread from 2 days ago, hard but edible, and a pot of stew she'd made that morning. She ladled some into a bowl and brought it back to him. "Eat," she said. He took the bowl, but didn't touch the spoon, just stared down at the stew like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Ethan," Rachel said, her voice firm, "eat." He obeyed, lifting the spoon to his lips with shaking hands. The first bite seemed to unlock something inside him, and he ate quickly after that, scraping the bowl clean in less than a minute. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and looked up at her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Rachel placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "Because Daniel would have wanted me to." Ethan's eyes shone, but he didn't let the tears fall. He just nodded once and looked away. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the hills in shades of red and gold. And somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats echoed on the road. Rachel heard the riders before she saw them. The sound came from the east, a rhythmic thunder that grew louder with each passing second. She was at the well, drawing water for the evening, when the noise made her freeze. Ethan was inside, resting. He'd fallen asleep almost immediately after eating, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. She set the bucket down and shaded her eyes, peering toward the road. 3 horses, 3 men. Her stomach dropped. Sheriff Dalton rode at the front, his badge catching the dying light. Behind him were 2 others, one she recognized as Clayton Webb, a rancher who'd lost his land in a card game and blamed everyone but himself. The other was a stranger, lean and hard-eyed, with a rifle slung across his back. Rachel wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the middle of the yard, placing herself between the cabin and the approaching riders. Her heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. The horses slowed as they reached the edge of her property, then stopped. Dalton dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The other 2 stayed in their saddles, watching. "Mrs. Harmon," Dalton said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Hope we're not interrupting." "You are," Rachel said evenly. "What do you want?" Dalton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just following up on today's transaction. See, after you left, I got to thinking, that man you bought, turns out he's got a price on his head." Rachel's blood went cold. "What?" "Yep." Dalton reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn. He unfolded it and held it up so she could see the printed words, "Wanted," and below that, a name, Ethan Cole. "Not Harmon, Cole. Seems your new acquisition is wanted in 3 counties for murder," Dalton continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Shot a man named Harrison Cole 8 years ago, walked free on some technicality, but the Cole family never forgot. They've been looking for him ever since." Rachel's mind raced. Ethan had told her about the shooting, had said it was self-defense, that the jury had believed him. But now Dalton was holding a wanted poster, and the name on it was Cole, not Harmon. "That's impossible," she said. "He was acquitted." "Acquitted in a county court," Dalton said, But Harrison Cole's brother, Sterling Cole, he's a federal marshal now, and he's been real patient, waiting for this piece of trash to show his face again. He folded the poster and tucked it back into his coat. So here's how this is gonna work. You're gonna hand him over, and I'm gonna collect the bounty. Nice and simple. No, Rachel said. Dalton's smile vanished. Excuse me. I bought him, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. $1, legal and binding. You took the money, that makes him mine. That was before I knew he was a wanted man, Dalton snapped. The sale's void. That's not how the law works, Rachel said. Clayton Webb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You hear that, Sheriff? She's lecturing you on the law. Dalton's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, close enough that Rachel could smell the tobacco on his breath. Mrs. Harmon, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but if you keep pushing, I can make things real difficult for you. A pregnant widow living alone out here, anything could happen. Rachel didn't move, didn't blink. Get off my property. For a moment, Dalton just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and gestured to the stranger with the rifle. Check the cabin. No, Rachel said, but the man was already dismounting, his hand moving to the rifle on his back. The door to the cabin swung open. Ethan stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. He'd pulled on a shirt, one of Daniel's old ones, and his face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. I'm right here, Dalton, he said. His voice was hoarse, but there was steel underneath. No need to go scaring women. Dalton turned, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. Well, Ethan Cole, or is it Harmon now? Heard you were using your brother's name to hide. My brother's dead, Ethan said flatly, and I've got nothing to hide. Is that so? Dalton's hand hovered over his gun. Then you won't mind coming back to town with me. We'll sort this out nice and legal. Ethan didn't move. The jury acquitted me 8 years ago. You've got no grounds. Sterling Cole says different, Dalton said, and he's got the federal badge to back it up. Rachel stepped forward, placing herself between Dalton and the cabin. You're not taking him. Dalton's eyes narrowed. You really want to die for a man you just met, Mrs. Harmon? I want you off my land, Rachel said. The tension stretched taut, like a rope about to snap. The stranger with the rifle shifted in his saddle, his finger brushing the trigger. Clayton Webb licked his lips, his gaze darting between Dalton and Ethan. Then, from the hills to the west, another sound, hoofbeats fast and urgent. Everyone turned. A rider crested the hill, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, then another, and another, 5 in total, all moving fast. Dalton swore under his breath. The riders reached the yard and reined in their horses, forming a loose line between Dalton and the cabin. Rachel recognized them, ranch hands from the neighboring properties, men who'd worked alongside Daniel before the war, men who'd come to his funeral and pressed coins into her hand when she couldn't afford the coffin. Old Tom Fletcher was at the front, his grizzled face set in hard lines. He didn't dismount, just looked down at Dalton from his saddle. Sheriff, he said, his voice like gravel, something we can help you with. Dalton's hand moved away from his gun. This is official business, Tom, doesn't concern you. Mrs. Harmon's a neighbor, Tom said. That makes it our business. We saw you riding out here, another man added. Figured we'd defollow just to make sure everything was lawful. Dalton's face darkened. You calling me a liar? I'm saying, Tom said slowly, that a pregnant widow living alone don't need 3 armed men showing up at her door after dark. Looks bad, Dalton, real bad. The stranger with the rifle shifted uncomfortably. Clayton Webb had gone pale. Dalton glared at Tom, then at the other men, then finally at Rachel. His jaw worked, grinding his teeth. This ain't over, he said. Didn't figure it was, Tom replied. Dalton turned and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. He yanked the reins hard, and the horse reared slightly before wheeling around. Clayton and the stranger followed, and the 3 of them rode off into the twilight, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon. Rachel's knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Ethan hadn't been there, his hand catching her elbow. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, even though she wasn't sure it was true. Tom dismounted and approached, his eyes flicking between Rachel and Ethan. "Ma'am, you sure you know what you're doing here?" "No," Rachel admitted, "but thank you for coming." Tom nodded. "Daniel was a good man, helped me out more than once. Figure I owe him." He glanced at Ethan. "You his brother?" "Half," Ethan said. Tom studied him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "Well, you got his eyes, and if Rachel says you're all right, then I reckon you're all right." He tipped his hat. "We'll keep watch tonight, case Dalton gets any ideas." "You don't have to," Rachel started. "We do," Tom said simply, "and we will." He remounted, and the 5 men rode to the edges of the property, spreading out into the shadows. Rachel turned to Ethan, her hands shaking. "You should have stayed inside." "And let you face them alone," he shook his head. "Not a chance." She wanted to argue, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she just looked at him, this man she'd bought for $1, this stranger who was also family, this ghost of a brother she'd never known. "Come on," she said finally, "let's get inside." As they stepped back into the cabin, the last of the sunlight bled out of the sky, leaving only darkness and the distant call of a coyote. "So let me ask you something. If you were Rachel, standing there with a man you didn't know, carrying a secret you weren't sure you could trust, what would you have done? Would you have let him stay? Would you have believed his story? Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and think about that. And if you're still with me, tap subscribe so you don't miss how this turns out." The cabin was quiet that night, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft whistle of wind through the gaps in the shutters. Rachel sat at the small table, mending one of Daniel's old shirts by candlelight. Her fingers moved automatically, needle threading in and out, but her mind was elsewhere. Ethan sat on the floor near the hearth, his back against the stone, watching the flames. He'd insisted he didn't need the bed, said he'd slept on worse. Rachel hadn't argued. She was too tired. "You should sleep," Ethan said after a while. Not looking at her. "So should you." "I will." "You're lying." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Yeah." Rachel set down the shirt and rubbed her eyes. "Why did you come back?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it up to the firelight, a small, tarnished pocket watch, its glass face cracked. "Daniel gave me this," he said quietly, "the day I left, said it was our father's, said I should keep it so I'd always have something to come home to." Rachel's throat tightened. She'd seen that watch before. Daniel had shown it to her once, said it was the only thing his father had left him. "I thought if I came back," Ethan continued, "maybe we could start over, be brothers again. Stupid, I know." "It's not stupid," Rachel said softly. Ethan closed his hand around the watch. "He talked about you, you know, in his letters, said you were the best thing that ever happened to him, said when the war was over, he was gonna build you a real house, with glass windows and a porch that wrapped all the way around." Rachel's vision blurred. She blinked hard, willing the tears back. "He loved you," Ethan said, "more than anything." "I know," Rachel whispered. They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning low. Then Rachel pushed herself up from the chair, crossed to the small shelf near the window, and pulled down a wooden box. She brought it back to the table and opened it carefully. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied with a faded ribbon. Daniel's letters, sent from the front lines. "He wrote to me every week," Rachel said, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "Even when he was sick. Even when," she trailed off, unable to finish. Ethan stood and crossed to the table, his movements slow and careful. He looked down at the letters, then at Rachel. "Can I?" he asked. She nodded. He picked up the top letter, unfolded it, and read silently. His eyes moved across the page, and Rachel saw his expression shift, grief, regret, something that looked like wonder. He was happy, Ethan said, his voice thick. Really happy. He was, Rachel said, right up until the end. Ethan set the letter down gently, like it might shatter. I'm sorry for not being here, for not. Stop, Rachel said. You couldn't have known. Doesn't make it easier. No, Rachel agreed, it doesn't. She reached into the box and pulled out one more letter, this one unopened, the wax seal still intact. Her name was written on the front in Daniel's careful script. He gave this to the chaplain before he died, Rachel said to give it to me if he didn't make it home. Ethan's gaze dropped to the letter. You haven't opened it. No. Why? Rachel's hand trembled as she held the letter. Because once I do, that's it. That's the last thing he'll ever say to me. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes shining, and I'm not ready for it to be over. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood. They stood there for a moment, two people bound by grief and blood, and a man who'd loved them both. Then Rachel set the letter back in the box and closed the lid. You should rest, she said. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. All right. He returned to his spot by the fire, and Rachel climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket over herself. The baby shifted inside her, a small flutter against her ribs, and she placed a hand over her belly. I wish you could have met him, she whispered to the child. He would have loved you. Across the room, Ethan's voice came soft through the darkness. I'll keep you safe, he said. Both of you, I swear it. Rachel closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 months, she didn't cry herself to sleep. Morning came cold and grey, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Rachel woke to the sound of voices outside, low and urgent. She pulled herself out of bed, her body stiff and aching, and crossed to the window. Tom Fletcher and his men were still there, gathered near the fence line, and they weren't alone. At least a dozen riders had arrived, men and women from the neighboring ranches, all armed. They stood in a loose circle, talking quietly, their faces set in grim determination. Rachel pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. Ethan was already there, standing beside Tom, his expression wary. What's happening? Rachel asked. Tom turned to her, his weathered face creased with worry. Dalton came back an hour ago, brought sterling coal with him. Rachel's heart sank. The marshal. Yep, Tom gestured toward the road. They're waiting at the edge of your property. Cole says he's here to arrest Ethan for murder, says the acquittal was a sham, that the jury was intimidated. That's not true, Ethan said sharply. The jury saw the evidence. They knew it was self-defense. Don't matter what they knew, Tom said. Cole's got a federal badge now, and he's got Dalton backing him. Rachel felt the ground tilt beneath her. She looked at Ethan, saw the resignation in his eyes. I'll go, he said quietly. I'm not letting this fall on you. No, Rachel said. Rachel. No, she repeated, her voice firm. She turned to Tom. How many men does Cole have with him? 4, counting Dalton. And how many do we have? Tom blinked. Ma'am. How many? Rachel pressed. Tom looked around at the gathered riders, then back at her. 15, maybe 16. Rachel nodded. Then we outnumber them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the women, Sarah Brennan, who ran the general store in town, stepped forward. Mrs. Harmon, she said carefully, what exactly are you suggesting? Rachel met her gaze. I'm suggesting we stand our ground. Ethan grabbed her arm. Rachel, you can't. Yes, I can, Rachel said, pulling free. She turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice rising. Ethan Cole was acquitted 8 years ago. The law said he was innocent. And now a man with a grudge and a badge is trying to overturn that verdict because he didn't like the outcome. She paused, letting the words sink in. If we let him take Ethan today, Rachel continued, what's to stop him from coming after someone else tomorrow? What's to stop Dalton from using his badge to settle old scores? The crowd was silent, listening. My husband fought in the war, Rachel said, her voice shaking now but holding steady. He fought so we could live in a place where the law meant something, where justice wasn't just whatever the man with the gun said it was. She placed a hand on her belly, and I'll be damned if I let his sacrifice mean nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Tom Fletcher spat into the dirt and pulled his rifle from his saddle. "She's right," he said. "Dalton's been abusing that badge for too long, and if Cole thinks he can ride into our county and drag off one of our own without a fight, he's got another think coming." One by one, the others nodded. Sarah Brennan pulled a shotgun from her wagon. Another man checked the rounds in his revolver. Rachel looked at Ethan, saw the disbelief in his eyes. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," Rachel said, "but we're going to anyway." They rode out together, all 16 of them, forming a line across the road leading to Rachel's property. Rachel sat in the wagon, Ethan beside her, his jaw tight. At the edge of the property, Sterling Cole waited on a black horse, flanked by Dalton and 3 other men. Cole was older than Rachel had expected, his face lined and hard, his eyes cold. Tom Fletcher reined in his horse a few yards from Cole, the others spreading out behind him. "Marshal," Tom said evenly, "you're on private property." Cole didn't flinch. "I'm here on federal business." "Federal business ended 8 years ago," Tom said. "Ethan Cole was tried and acquitted. You've got no grounds to arrest him." "I've got grounds," Cole said, his voice flat, "and I've got a badge, that's all I need." "Not here," Tom said, "not in our county." Cole's gaze swept across the line of riders, taking in their numbers, their weapons, their faces. Then he looked at Rachel. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "this doesn't concern you." "It does," Rachel said, "because Ethan is family." Cole's jaw tightened. "He killed my brother." "In self-defense," Rachel said. "Your brother came onto his property with a gun. The jury heard the evidence. They made their decision." "The jury was wrong," Cole said. "Or maybe you just don't like that the law didn't go your way," Rachel shot back. For a long moment, Cole and Rachel stared at each other. Then Cole's hand moved toward his revolver. Tom's rifle came up faster. "Don't," Tom said quietly. Cole froze. His men shifted nervously, hands hovering over their weapons, but they were outnumbered and they knew it. Dalton cleared his throat. "Cole, maybe we should." "Shut up, Dalton," Cole snapped. He looked at Ethan. "This isn't over." "It is," Ethan said. His voice was steady, calm. "I'm sorry your brother's dead, but I'm not sorry I defended myself, and I'm not sorry I'm still alive." Cole's face twisted with rage, but he didn't draw. Instead, he yanked his horse's reins and wheeled around, riding back toward town. Dalton and the others followed, their heads down. The line of riders stayed where they were until the last of the dust had settled. Then Tom lowered his rifle and let out a long breath. "Well," he said, "that went better than I expected." A ripple of laughter ran through the group, nervous but genuine. Sarah Brennan rode up beside Rachel's wagon. "You did good," she said. Rachel managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, all of you." One by one, the riders tipped their hats and rode off, back to their ranches and their lives. Tom lingered for a moment longer. "You need anything, Mrs. Harmon, you send word," he said. "I will," Rachel promised. Tom nodded, then rode off after the others. Rachel and Ethan sat in the wagon, watching the sun break through the clouds and spill light across the valley. "I can't stay," Ethan said after a while. "Cole's not gonna let this go." "I know," Rachel said, "but you don't have to leave today." Ethan looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Rachel said, placing a hand on her belly, "that this baby's going to need family, and you're the closest thing we've got." Ethan's eyes shone. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "All right," he said hoarsely, "all right." 3 months later. The first snow fell on the day Rachel's daughter was born. Ethan had been out chopping wood when he heard the cry from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and ran, bursting through the door to find Sarah Brennan holding a tiny, squalling bundle wrapped in a blanket. "It's a girl," Sarah said, grinning. Rachel lay in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling. Ethan crossed to her side, his hands shaking. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Rachel looked up at him. "Will you hold her?" Ethan hesitated, then reached out and took the baby carefully, cradling her against his chest. She stopped crying, her tiny eyes blinking up at him. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said, "Hope." Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the valley in white, and in the cabin, a new family began. Years later, the cabin had grown, a second room added, a porch wrapped around the front, a small barn out back. Hope was 5 now, wild-haired and fearless, chasing chickens through the yard while her mother watched from the porch. Ethan stood beside Rachel, a hammer in his hand, surveying the fence he'd just finished repairing. "Looks good," Rachel said. "It'll hold," Ethan replied. He glanced at her and she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. In the distance, the sun dipped lower, painting the hills in gold. And for the first time in years, the ghosts that had haunted them both seemed to rest.